So folks, these are the murdered cards of Castle Nathria. As I do every expansion, I wanted to take a look at cards that have in one way or another eclipsed cards of old, and sometimes that will be just very obvious, very objective examples of a card being way better, like the ones you see behind me. And sometimes it'll be a more subtle or subjective improvement of a card over time. And this is not some giant complaint about power creep necessarily. We might talk about power creep here and there, and some of these will be great healthy evolutions of cards. Others might be problematic. We'll discuss as we get into each card. But kicking it off, this is probably the most obvious and egregious example of a murdered card in Castle Nathria. In fact, it even took the background art here as well. Plot of Sin is just a way better version of landscaping. Literally the exact same effect. Same cost, same effect. They're both nature spells, nothing different, but Plot of Sin has this straight up infuse upside. And although Plot of Sin is not a card we're seeing a ton in standard format Hearthstone, that infuse upside is also just really naturally synergistic for the kind of token druid package. Now, I guess someone could technically argue, you could make an argument that ancients, but Regis ancients don't synergize with things that care specifically about tree ant synergies. What if you have a mulch muncher, Regis? The ancients won't synergize with the mulch muncher, and yeah, okay, sure. I guess technically you're right, but in 99.9% of scenarios, Plot of Sin, it's just better. And I think it's a cool evolution, because landscaping definitely is not a card that would keep up in today's landscape of Hearthstone, but Plot of Sin is a totally fair, fine card. It's not overpowered, it doesn't feel broken, and it's a good way to utilize a keyword from an expansion to basically update and modernize a card and increase its power level enough that it has a chance to see competitive play. So I think this is a totally fine, healthy evolution. I think it's a little unfortunate when cards are just straight up one-to-one better. There's very discrete, obvious examples like this. Usually there's some other small tweak they make that doesn't make the cards feel identical, so that would be a change, I guess. But all in all, I don't think this is a problematic murdering in any case. So moving on, this one's a little bit more subjective, but I think probably closer than you might think at first glance. Sire Denathrius, I would argue, has murdered Cthulhu. But I thought Sire Denathrius was the one who got murdered, Regis. No, he's murdered Cthulhu. And this is a fun comparison, because both of these I think were really staple legendaries for their expansion. Of course, Cthulhu from Whispers of the Old Gods had this entire build around package where you had all these Cthulhu support cards that took up a large portion of the neutral set in Hearthstone, and also had some class-based synergies as well. So even though there were multiple old gods, it really felt like Cthulhu was kind of the centerpiece and the star of the show. And of course, Sire Denathrius is also the star of Castle Nathria, quite literally, and of course, from a meta standpoint as well, has proved very, very powerful. And in essence, they both do the same thing. They both get bigger throughout the course of the game, and then they're used as this finisher piece. Now, you know, the details are a little different. Cthulhu got bigger stats as well, so sometimes the body on Cthulhu could matter. Of course, that could be important. Cthulhu actually deals his damage a little bit differently, which has some relevances here and there. Denathrius does it in a chunk. Cthulhu does it in individual pings and missiles. So that's had some distinct differences. But the big difference, and the reason Denathrius I think is a much better card than Cthulhu. I know people think Cthulhu was insane. He was good, but Denathrius is insane. Denathrius is played, I would argue, probably 20 to 30% more than Cthulhu in his meta. Cthulhu showed up in a handful of decks here and there. Denathrius is in a lot of decks. So the reason Denathrius is better is that he doesn't demand you build your deck towards him in a completely narrow parasitic fashion. Cthulhu, you had to run the Cthulhu cards. Denathrius, you can run whatever minions you want. Any minion is still going to pump up and infuse Denathrius, unlike Cthulhu, which demanded very specific and often weaker units to support him. So if you wanted that big win condition, you had to make some sacrifices along the way. Denathrius, you don't really have to sacrifice much. Just run minions, which most decks are happy to do anyway, and Denathrius gets pumped up really, really quickly. Yeah, you guys are making some great points. Cthulhu can get bigger in deck, where Denathrius does have to be in hand. to get bigger. That's nice. Like that's an upside for Cthulhu. He's scrapping here. He's trying to fight. Don't kill me yet, Denathrius. But again, I think this is one of those where the data and the results really just showcase that Denathrius is ultimately a much stronger card. We didn't even talk about the lifesteal side of Denathrius as well. I like Cthulhu a lot more than I like Denathrius, and I think a lot of people probably feel the same way. Maybe it's good that he was played a little less or appeared in fewer decks, or you had to build into him as opposed to being a universal win condition. Perhaps that's why we remember him so favorably. That might tell us a lot, but I love Cthulhu. Denathrius, we're not best friends. Moving on here, we have another pretty straightforward example, I think. This is Batty Guest versus Possessed Villager. Batty Guest is a 1/1 for 1 mana that has a death rattle that summons a beast. Possessed Villager summons a shadow beast, but the big difference here is Batty Guest has a 2/1 bat. Its beast is a 2/1. Possessed Villager was only a 1/1, so literally just better stat line on the death rattle here for Batty Guest. And of course, also the bat being a beast is actually very relevant for Hunter. They have things that interact well with beasts, of course, being a hunter. Okay, so not a type, as indeed I thought. So the type advantage there is nice. Also, it's noteworthy that Possessed Villager is a card that actually got played a lot. Zoo Warlocks played Possessed Villager as a nice, sticky 1 mana card that you could use with buff follow-ups. So, a lot of the times we'll look at these cards that get murdered in one way or another, and they weren't good usually, right? And that's a lot of people's argument that it's not power creep, which that's a big discussion we're not going to get into here. But in this case, Possessed Villager actually did get played a lot. It was a very prominent Zoo Warlock card for a while. And Batty Guest just straight up eclipsed it. And Batty Guest is good. It's getting played. I don't think it's a crazy card by any means, though. It definitely does not feel broken or overpowered to me. It's just a good, strong hunter card with some viability. So cool to see the comparison here. A great card got straight up better, and it's still not broken. Obviously, these are across different classes. So, there's an argument Warlock maybe could have utilized this better, but I don't think that's true, really. I think Hunter and Infused decks in particular utilize this really, really well. So I don't think there's a particular class advantage for the Villager. I think he has straight up been murdered in this case. All right, so next up here, Death Blossom Womper is, I think, a murderer of Seeping Oozling. I actually kind of forgot about this card in Hunter. It did get played a little bit, I think, in some Death Rattle Hunter lists back in the day, but it was like, I remember being kind of fringe, and there were, cube lines you wanted to take more often instead, but you'd still pop in an Oozling from time to time. And I realized just how similar these cards are, really. They're both 6-cost cards. The Womper is a 7/6 instead of a 5/4, so a monster stat upgrade here. It gets +2/+2 in stats. And they both gain the death rattle of a minion in your deck, but the Womper also draws the minion as well. So you get a resource advantage, you get a bigger stat line, and you still get the death rattles. And on top of that, I would argue Druid, as a class with a lot of ramp, is actually playing the Womper even sooner than the Oozling. So really coming down before turn 6, whereas the Hunter probably didn't have as many ways to cheat out an Oozling. So it's faster, it's bigger, and it's better from a resource advantage as well. Now, one could argue, the Oozling maybe wants to keep cards in the deck so that it has more death rattles for the next Oozling. It's pretty shaky there. I mean, yes, technically, but hopefully you'd have enough death rattles that wasn't a particularly big risk, unless you had one like super targeted one. So there could be some niche there where the keeping it in deck was actually advantageous. But I think in 99% of cases, the Womper just does more, does it bigger, and does it faster, and therefore pretty firmly eclipse what the Oozling was all about. So again, we have a card that was playable here, getting just stomped on, or womped, as one might put it. Getting absolutely womped. And Womper is not even a crazy card. It's just fine. Again, it's not like a busted card or anything. It just fits into Druid fair. And honestly, I don't think a lot of Druids are even playing Womper right now. I think it's not even good enough for Druids at the moment. Maybe they'll get a Death Rattle package that comes along and amps it up a little bit. But yeah, right now it's in 0.2% of decks. So despite the womping, still not wompy enough. This one's really fun, I think. It's because it's so close together in release. Usually when we do these, I compare a new card to a card that came out 5 years ago, and it's perhaps not always remarkable that it's much better. But Coilfang Constrictor just came out, and I bet you forgot this card existed. It doesn't even look like a real card because it got leaked early, the artwork or something, for a while, or maybe even the full card, and then people kind of forgot about it, and then it came out, and it's like, oh, what happened to Coilfang Constrictor? And now Theatar comes around basically like 2 months later, right? Because mini set to release is like 2 months, and it just does what Coilfang Constrictor does 1,000 times better. And no, it's not exactly the same effect, but in essence, the result with Theatar is 1,000 times better, because with the Coilfang Constrictor, you're just delaying whatever card they had by a turn. Just missing one turn next turn, that's it. Just stopping it for a turn. With Theatar, you're just outright stealing the card. And of course, yes, Theatar, you give them one of your own cards. Yes, that is a downside, of course, but not really, right? We all know Theatar is completely insane. Incredibly powerful card, played all across the meta, and giving your opponent a 2-drop and taking their Denathrius is a pretty dang good trade. Whereas with Coilfang Constrictor, just delaying a Denathrius by a turn isn't often going to make much difference. And it's all in the data, right? Theatar is actually in right now 52% of decks, which is just insane. Half of every deck runs him. Coilfang Constrictor, on the other hand, is in 0.04% of decks. So I think the people have decided which is better. Now, it's interesting. Coilfang Constrictor is in 1% of wild decks. I wonder if he pops up in like Shutterwalk decks. Maybe that's why Coilfang is played there a little bit. Theatar might be worse in Shutterwalk decks, because if this hits enough, you just probably shut down your opponent's entire hand. So that's kind of a cool use case there for like Battlecry repeats over and over again. Maybe it's worth it, but often very, very not worth it. And, you know, the stat line bump here does not feel like it's good enough. I don't think that makes nearly enough difference. I do remember people being fairly excited about Coilfang Constrictor when it got revealed. I don't think anybody even played this prior to Theatar either, though, honestly. At least I don't remember seeing it hardly ever. This next one's kind of interesting because I went back to the original version of Thoughtsteal. As you may know, Thoughtsteal right now in core Hearthstone is 2 mana. It was buffed to 2 mana to keep it up with modern standards, which makes sense because Identity Theft just got released, which is a way better version of Thoughtsteal that's 3 mana. So compared to the original, you can really see the difference here. Thoughtsteal gave you 2 random cards in your opponent's deck, whereas with Identity Theft, you get to pick both of those cards. And needless to say, that makes it insane because suddenly you can pick the Denathrius in your opponent's deck or hand, as opposed to some random 1 mana garbage spell or something that Thoughtsteal would give you. So tripling your odds basically of finding something good, or at the very least always getting the best of the options in front of you, which it's clearly going to increase the consistency and payoff here of Identity Theft quite a bit. And there's also new Thief stuff to support that, pay it off with Harvester. Maybe not the best, but still has some synergies, and it's a shadow spell too, which does matter. There are things that certainly demand you have shadow spells in hand, like the Nether Drake right now needs you to have shadow spells, so it gives you a little bit of extra utility there off of the spell school as well. So all in all, way better than the original version of Thoughtsteal, and apparently better than even the current upgraded buffed version of Thoughtsteal as well, because there are some priest decks out there right now running Identity Theft, and I have not seen any priest decks running Thoughtsteal. We could, I guess, check the data real quick just to make sure, but is Thoughtsteal, did it rotate out? Oh, Thoughtsteal's not even in the game anymore. it's in wild, but it was 2 mana in standard last core set. I'm fairly certain. So no, nobody's running Thoughtsteal right now because it's not in the game at 2 mana. But either way, Identity Theft clearly better than the original Thoughtsteal. That's the reason. Yeah, no joke. Which I like this, by the way. This, I think, Discover in a lot of ways is a nice balance to randomness. Thoughtsteal, right? It's just pure chaos. You have almost, well, really no influence over what you're getting outside of maybe when you play the Thoughtsteal. Whereas with Identity Theft, you're getting to pick. You're reducing a little bit of that variance, which definitely increases power level, but also there's enough randomness in the 3 cards you're offered. There's still a little bit of randomness there, but you can manipulate it. You can control it. You can influence it, which I think is nice. It's sort of a mix of both, the best of both worlds, perhaps, with a card like Identity Theft. So next up is Stag Charge, and I wanted to compare this one to Flanking Strike specifically. Flanking Strike was actually a really prominent card in Hunter for a while there. It felt good, actually. Just take a nice swing on board, develop some stats, clear up your opponent's stuff. Felt like it often landed very well on turn 4. There were usually great targets to hit in one way or another. And now we have Stag Charges come along. It still deals 3 damage, but it can go face, which is nice because you can play it easily on an empty board of your head. Still play Stag Charge, still develop. Sometimes with Flanking Strike, it would be really tough because nothing to hit. You're just stuck with a Flanking Strike in hand that can't do stuff. So that's nice that it works always. On top of that, I think there's an argument that the Wild Seeds, there's an argument they're always better, or at the very least, I would say better on average for sure. Some would say that a 3-1 with Rush is better than a 3-3. That's debatable, and the dormant aspect of it is also nice because it can be protected from your opponent's removal. If you make a 3-3 that's awake, your opponent can remove it. If you make a 3-1 with Rush that's dormant, your opponent cannot remove it, which means you have a guaranteed attacker next turn. One could argue that is just distinctly better than the 3-3. Not in all scenarios, but on average is that 3-1 better. And then I think pretty clearly a 2-5 with Taunt and, of course, a 5-4 with a weapon are better minions. You're welcome to debate whether the delay in receiving those is better or worse. That is clearly debatable. I would still argue that I would rather have a Wild Seed in pretty much 96% of scenarios over a Flanking Strike. I think most of the time Wild Seeds are much better, and we're seeing that, right? Wild Seeds are very good. They're played a lot in various Hunter decks right now, which Hunter is also the best deck in the game in most ranks, and Stag Charge is certainly a part of that. So all in all, it's cheaper, it can go face, and I think it makes you better minions as well. So to me, this feels like a much better version of Flanking Strike. Clearly not as one-to-one of a comparison as some of the others we've seen, but in essence and in spirit, feels like it has murdered Flanking Strike. Decaying Katana even says this feels like a blowout. I'm glad you guys are agreeing with that one. I was hesitant that some people would say the 3-3 Wolf is better, but I like, yes, you get it sooner, that's better. So again, I think it is very debatable, but I think ultimately, if you're looking at it in the spirit of what's better, the Wild Seeds feel better to me. Of course, also just being a mana cheaper and going face is a big deal for Hunter. I feel like I focus so much on the Wild Seed aspect. I didn't really weigh enough that it's 1 mana cheaper and goes face. That's pretty insane. This one's pretty cool. We got the Sinful Sous Chef versus the Dry Gulch Jailer. There's a lot of Kobolds and Catacombs cards on this list, I'm realizing right now. We've had this guy, we had so the Oozling, the Flanking Strike, and the Dry Gulch Jailer all here getting evolved in some way. And here we've got a card that is half as much mana, it has more stats, and all you give up is 1 Silverhand Recruit in hand, which that is worse. You only get 2 instead of 3, but I think the Sinful Sous Chef is pretty clearly the champ in this case. Better stats, half the cost, and you're still getting a lot of stuff in hand, right? You're still fueling Silverhand Recruits. So yeah, obviously not, again, 1-to-1, but it just feels like a way cleaner, tighter version of the Dry Gulch Jailer design. And even from a curve standpoint, like, it still fits the curve nicely. It's a 1 into a 2 mana play, whereas Jailer was a 2 into a 3 mana play. So it's not like you're really sacrificing from a curve standpoint there either. Now, interestingly, I don't really remember Jailer getting played even in the various Silverhand versions of Paladin from Gin and Baku. I'm trying to think if there was overlap there. Witchwood came out right after Kobolds and Catacombs, right? So it would have shown up, but I don't think, well, obviously it wouldn't be in an odd deck, but was it even in the even deck? I don't think it was, right? Because you cared more about, you didn't really care about Silverhand Recruits in the even deck so much. You just had the hero power, but you didn't have as many synergies. It was odd Paladin that really relied on Silverhand Recruits, right? So I don't remember this played a ton, to be honest. But neither is Sinful Sous Chef right now. Sinful Sous Chef is not getting played. So even though I would argue it's much, much better, still not enough to drive Silverhand Recruit Paladin at the moment. So there's something about this effect that might just be too slow, or demands too much hand buff, or demands too much Silverhand Recruit synergy to really feel worth it. Something about these cards just seems to fall a little bit short. You seem to remember Dragel's Jailer more favorably than I do, but I feel like you had Call to Arms decks that wanted like good stats off the Call to Arms, and you cut. Like I just don't remember people would be wanting to run Jailer. Like you wanted it to be as much tempo as possible immediately. I don't feel like the recruits in hand would have supported the even Paladin package very well. I obviously don't remember every deck list and every detail, but instinctually that sounds off to me. Like, but there was still the Kobolds and Catacombs era prior to Gin, so maybe there was some moment there where Jailer got played. But I don't remember Dude stuff succeeding until Witchwood with Gin and Baku, and then I don't know how this fits into a Gin deck very well. I just maybe there were people who ran it with Call to Arms, I don't know, but it feels like I wouldn't have. I think you wanted the like statty Divine Shield stuff off Call to Arms usually, right? So I got one card left. This is kind of the most sideways comparison. This is the weirdest, most unclear comparison in the video, I think, but still thought it was worth calling out. This is Boon of the Ascended, of course, being played a ton right now in Naga Priest decks. You can make some gigantic copied minions with Boon of the Ascended. And I thought it'd be fun to compare it to Faceless Shambler, because they actually, if you look closely, do pretty similar things. They both basically are 4-mana ways to copy some stats that have been made on board. But Boon of the Ascended is very clearly an absurdly powerful card, and I think Faceless Shambler probably only ever peaked at a solid card. I do think some handlocks and stuff ran it. It was solid. It got played. It didn't just fall to the wayside. It was good, relevant card, but Boon is like meta driving right now. One of the most powerful cards in Hearthstone, I would argue, and there's a big difference. I think spells, number one, are often easier to use. The +2 health here is absolutely not irrelevant. You're buffing both the original minion and the copied version, which is nice. It can't be silenced, which is important in some cases. The Faceless Shambler would add the stats, as I recall. I believe they were green numbers, whereas with Boon, they're white numbers that do not get silenced off, which is pretty nice. And then finally, with the card Pelagos in Priest specifically, Pelagos interacts really well with any targeted spells. So that's another way to make Boon of the Ascended increase stats in combination with Pelagos. So all in all, pretty interesting upgrade here. Now, obviously, this is a Priest card versus a neutral card. There's no value statements being made here. It doesn't mean Shambler's garbage and what a waste. Doesn't mean Boon is broken or OP or power creeped. Just a fun comparison here. How these kind of things have evolved. Oh yeah, great point. Yeah, Boon can target enemy minions as well. Yes, that's actually used very commonly in Naga Priest to target enemy minions. If you're just behind and your opponent makes something big, you can make your own big version with Taunt. And sometimes that's enough to stabilize or swing a game, which you cannot do with Faceless Shambler. So another enormous upside here. Faceless is better if you have no minions. It's true. It's true. You can make a 1/1 Taunt on an empty board with Faceless, but you cannot with Boon. See, he's scrapping. He's fighting. He's not giving up. He's gonna win. Man, oh man, I like that. I like that. Did you guys have any other examples? Sometimes I don't notice everything. Obviously, there's a lot of cards. It's hard to remember every possible comparison. For instance, I did not even notice this comparison until a second pass. I didn't think of this one right away. They really aren't that far apart. So Death Revenant, yeah, I forgot about this card completely. My God, if you'd showed me this artwork, I'm not sure I would have known this was a real Hearthstone card. I do not remember this artwork at all. But yeah, I think this is actually a pretty good comparison. I'll give you this one. Death Revenant, Battlecry gain +1/+1 for each damaged minion. So it's a 5-mana 3/3 that just gains stats. And then for only one more mana with Olgra, you gain +4 base health, and you get all of these bonus attacks as well. So yeah, you get a ton for 1 mana. That is actually a pretty big murder there. Cool. All right, guys, I gotta run.